coming out. I'm Corey Lucas, Stewardship Manager here at Cedar Creek Institute. And
I'm Sarah Nelson. I'm the Executive Director of the Berry Conservation District.
So what we're going to run through today is kind of get you caught up on the work we've done on Cedar Creek to this point. We were delayed initially with some of our approvals, but kind of got back on track in July, and so we'll share the water quality monitoring we've done and some of the other progress that's happened on the project. I would say we're behind where we wanted to be when we started the project, but considering everything, we're doing pretty good. So kind of my job in this whole project is to administrate the project, to make sure the different pieces are running smoothly and to make sure we're hitting timelines and we're hitting project goals. Matt can introduce himself here.
I'm Matt Dykstra, Field Station Manager with Cedar Creek Institute.
So Matt's primary responsibilities on this project are to handle a lot of the water quality monitoring. So some of you have seen him, out on your lakes or out on the stream with our Grand Valley State University students. So that's kind of been his responsibilities, and so he's going to share some updates on water quality monitoring and kind of some preliminary results from that. And then I'll let Sarah kind of introduce what she's going to share tonight.
Great, thanks. So I'm going to talk about how we take watershed management plans and start implementing the recommendations in them to lead to reductions in different pollutants and healthier waterways in general. And so I'll go over one project that we're finishing up now to kind of see the potential of a project like that. And then I'll also introduce two new projects that I think could really complement the watershed planning process.
And typically, in a typical steering committee meeting like this, we would go around and everyone would introduce themselves, but I think we've got a good sized group here, and that's probably going to chew through all our time. So if you don't know somebody, or you're interested in how someone's connected to the project, feel free to, after the meeting here, kind of do a little discussion and hang out for a bit. So I'm going to jump right into the handouts. So did everyone grab handouts? If you haven't, we can kind of disperse them. Just want to make sure you've got this in front of you, because we're going to fly through this stuff. We're kind of under a tight time frame because this is what I could get away with here if I kind of agreed to these stipulations. So we are going to fly through this stuff. That's why we printed this out, so you have information to take home with you. Kind of, maybe regurgitate or take some time to understand what we're talking about. So the first page, if you flip past the agenda, you're going to have the Cedar Creek watershed map. And that map just shows you all kind of the extent of the Cedar Creek watershed. So when we talk about the watershed, we're talking about all the land that drains into Cedar Creek. And so that can kind of show you who your neighbors are in this project or who the other stakeholders are. So the big lakes that we targeted with monitoring are Wall Lake, Clear Lake, and then Big and Little Cedar Lake. So we couldn't do all of them. There's a lot of other small lakes in there. But we really picked the main lakes, and then we've done a lot of monitoring on our lakes here. So our own and Brewster Lakes on the property have been well monitored. You flip the next map. This one's going to show you where all our monitoring points are in Cedar Creek. These are kind of selected for a few different reasons. One of the main reasons is we had some existing data for some of these points. So some of those points are kind of pre-existing monitoring points. The other ones, we just felt like they were good points where there could potentially be non-point source inputs between the other monitoring points that were established quite a few years ago. And then we really wanted to include the lakes. We felt like a huge stakeholder group in this watershed are the lake residents. So we have those monitoring points on Wall Lake, Big and Little Cedar Lake, and Clear Lake. So that just kind of outlines where those are at. So when we're talking about water quality monitoring and our biological surveys, that's where we're taking those surveys from. The next page is just a progress report. So this is actually what gets submitted to EGLE on a quarterly basis. So this is our third quarter. We're almost done with our third quarter. We'll be done at the end of this month. So I've kind of started on the progress report for this quarter. I'm not going to go through it all because it will take us a half an hour. But please take this home and kind of review some of the stuff we've worked on. I would say the main items that we've accomplished to this point are our first season of water quality monitoring and biological surveys. Those were, like I said, done by Matt and our Grand Valley State University students that were hired through this project to complete that work. Our initial goal was to involve a lot more partners in that monitoring, but with COVID, there's a lot of restrictions on who you can have joining your crews. So that was kind of disappointing. We're hoping next season we might be able to get some more involvement from other stakeholders on actually going along on some of these surveys. So that was a big part of our accomplishments in the first season. We did get those biological surveys in before the deadline, so we stayed on our timelines there. Some of the areas we're probably lacking are our tillage surveys or our farming practices surveys. We weren't able to get out there and do that this spring due to COVID, so we missed a whole season. So those surveys are literally, we drive around the entire watershed, street by street. We look at the agricultural practices on all the fields in the watershed, and then we map it. And then we'll do an analysis to see how that's impacting the water quality. Where are there sources of pollution? Where could there be improvements? So we weren't able to do that this spring. So right off the bat, we're set back essentially another season on the project just to get that survey in. So that one's kind of lacking. We haven't started our social surveys yet, which don't need to be done quite yet, but we're hoping to get those quality assurance project plans completed in October, November, so we can start on social surveys. And I think that's where a lot of you may get involved with helping us kind of distribute that information. We want to learn from the stakeholders and the landowners in Cedar Creek, so that's going to be an important piece. Let's see what else we got. So policy review, land protections. Right now, all that stuff is on hold until we get our initial analysis done from our water quality sampling and our biological surveys. So we'll actually utilize that then to inform, some of the policy in land protection. So we haven't started that. We're hoping to get that kick-started here in the next quarter. So a lot of this work hopefully will be done in the fourth quarter, which will be October, November, December. And so we'll try to set up another meeting sometime around the end of the year, maybe maybe the first part of next year, and get you updated on what we were able to accomplish in that fourth quarter. I'm gonna check where we're at on time.
You got plenty of time, I think.
6:45.
All right. Any questions on that 5-minute spiel? Yeah, Doug.
Do you use any students in the fall, or is that just summer only?
It's just summer only, but how those projects are set up, the students' requirements are to do the data collection during the summer, and then they actually have to do some analysis, and some report writing, and that takes them into the fall. So those students usually aren't completing their portion of the project till October. So in October, and I think Matt will probably talk about it, in October we'll basically get some more data or some more analysis on the data we've collected that we can share with all of you for the first season of monitoring. Now there's some quirks in what we found in the first season that Matt will go over. So we're really hoping to confirm some things or get some things figured out for the second season. And we're going to do the same thing, hire students. This year they happen to be from Grand Valley State University, and we're also working with Dr. Eric Snyder. He's kind of the advisor on that project. So he'll be back next year as well to help with the monitoring. Yes?
The plane went over, so I couldn't hear you. Where did you, in some parts, did you say you were going to monitor any farming around the area?
Yes.
I thought I heard you say.
So there's a component of this project is to do what they call tillage surveys. So we've mapped out every farm field in the watershed. So there's a lot of them. I want to say there's like 900, if that's correct. Every little, it could be a 3-acre field, we're mapping it. So we mapped all those out, and we got to drive every road and look at what farming practices are being done on those fields. So there's some farming practices that are better for water quality than others, obviously. And so fields that aren't getting the best management practices, maybe we can develop a program with some of the work that Sarah does in the conservation district to implement best management practices on those fields, but it allows us to identify where those so does that make sense? If we do that, we do a tillage survey in the spring and in the fall. So you've got two, we've got to do it for 2 years. So we missed the spring one. So that means that's going to bump that part of the project back another basically 6 months, because we've got to get that next spring tillage survey, which we want to do. We don't want to skip. We want to make sure we have replicates of those.
Sure. And then do you go to those people and explain to them the programs and what they can and cannot?
Yes, that could be something. Generally what happens, this watershed management plan gets written and it identifies these things that you could do to improve the water quality in the watershed. And then we work with partners. Anybody can take this watershed plan, say, hey, I want to do this. Often it's the conservation district that takes some of those responsibilities and goes after those implementation grants, so they can go after funds to fund that kind of work. So maybe they get a grant that says, hey, we can go to farmers and we can give them incentives to do these best management practices, and then they would do that. So it's not like you walk around to a farmer and say, hey, you need to do this.
Right.
It's more of a voluntary type thing, but you have some incentives to back it up.
Okay, good.
So does that make sense?
Yes,
Okay.
thank you.
Anybody else have any questions? Okay, I'm gonna jump to Matt so he can talk about some water quality. And I will be around, so if you want to come talk to me after, we'll try to get out of here before it gets dark, but there will be some time to discuss.
All right, so I'm going to kind of be going through this handout. Most of the content in here was prepared by one of our students this summer. And so I've done a little bit of editing, but it's not like it's draft. It should actually just say kind of draft on it or something like that. But it does kind of provide a nice little summary of some of the things that we've done this past summer. So as Corey mentioned, we have 6 different sites on the creek, and we're also doing work in 4 different lakes. And so on that map, you can kind of see where those are. If you're looking at some of this, some of the stuff that's in here, you can kind of refer back to, what is CC1, where is CC1? Go ahead and check that out. What we're doing at these sites depends. So all the stream sites, we're using a sampling methodology that's been used by EGLE or the DEQ for a number of years. It's called the P51 Surface Water Assessment Section, or Procedure 51. And there's a number of different components in it, most of which we did kind of on a one-time visit, but there are some other components that we'll be doing that took a second visit or two. So a lot of it is going there to the site. We are looking at the substrate. So what's actually in the creek? What is it? Is the creek bed made out of rocks? Is it mostly sand? Is it muck? What's down there in the creek bed? We are looking at macroinvertebrates. What kind of critters are living at the bottom of the creek? Because that tells you something about water quality. We actually do a habitat assessment, so we're looking at the vegetation, the stream buffers, things like that. During those visits, we also brought our YSI multi-parameter probe, and so then we're looking at some basic kind of chemical, physical properties of the water. What is the temperature, how much oxygen, the specific conductivity, suspended solids, things like that, okay? How clear the water is. So those measures. In addition to that, we came back at another time with electrofishing unit, and we shocked those sections of creek and collected the fish and identified the fish and then released them. And so that gives us a fish sample. So that's what we did on those streams. In addition to that, we've done some water chemistry. We haven't actually completed all the water chemistry. We've done 2 samples, and I have results back from one of those and half results from another one of those. And hopefully we'll get a chance to do our 3rd sample sometime in the next couple of weeks. On the lakes, we've done some water chemistry samples at the outlets to those lakes. In addition, we've gone out on about a monthly basis, and we have developed lake temperature dissolved oxygen profiles. So essentially we go out to the middle of the lake, we send our YSI probe down to the bottom and just kind of see what's going on in the lake in regards to temperature, dissolved oxygen, clarity, things like that. And then another analysis, and I don't have any results because we're still working on the GIS component. In fact, Corey was talking about one of the students still working on a project. I was just in communication with her today, and she's working with a Grand Valley professor, and we'll continue to work on the GIS components and trying to analyze what's going on. But essentially, on these 4 lakes, we paddled around the lake or drove around the lake in one instance, or a couple instances, and looked at the shoreline and identified practices and water quality concerns on that shoreline. Some of it was done remotely through GIS, but we had that on-ground component. And so we'll be compiling and sharing that data directly with landowners at some point in the future. All right. So what are the results? And this kind of goes through here, and I'm just gonna run through them real quickly, and you can look at the numbers. But I'll just kind of tell you the interesting components. And sometimes it's interesting, sometimes it's not. So like pH, there's nothing interesting there, right? It's a pretty neutral pH, so nothing too unusual. Conductivity, we didn't get any kind of strange numbers. These are numbers that you would typically find on some type of, on a groundwater dominated system, okay?
What is conductivity?
Conductivity, the ability of the water to transmit electricity, but it tells you something about the mineral content in the water, okay? So you have ionic chemicals, salts, and they can be of a wide variety. And if you have more, you have higher conductivity, okay? So it can transmit that electricity a little bit better. So it's a common measure of getting away at looking at what's dissolved in the water. Dissolved oxygen, it's a flowing stream. There's nothing too unusual about what our dissolved oxygen is like. It's pretty decent. It's often closely connected to temperature. We don't have temperature listed there. The temperatures that we're getting are they're kind of like right on the boundary of what you could almost consider a cold water, but it becomes really hard for some of the cold water species to actually live in the stream. So there are sections that probably are a little bit colder or might work a little bit better for some of the cold water fishes, some of the trouts or whatever, but a lot of Cedar Creek is right on the edge. Turbidity, or how clear the water is, it's actually very clear. At least when we were sampling, on the times that we were sampling. Velocity, a lot of it obviously depends on where you are. Different areas are going to flow a little faster than others. In general, it's not a very fast-moving stream. On the lakes, there's some a couple of just kind of interesting things that we found. Most of the lakes are pretty similar to each other. There are a couple of differences on certain parameters. And so all of them kind of fit into this probably, mesotrophic kind of lake, maybe with the exception of Little Cedar Lake. The north basin of Little Cedar Lake is very different than the rest of the lakes.
Matt, do you want to explain what mesotrophic is?
Oh, sorry. On lakes you have kind of, they often get divided into 3 categories depending on the nutrient levels within those lakes. So you have oligotrophic, which is low nutrients, tend to be very clear, cold water, think Lake Superior. You have mesotrophic, which is like most lakes around here. And then you also have eutrophic, which is usually really, really high nutrients, lots of vegetation growth, and tends to be often essentially have pollution problems, nutrient problems in there. And so the lake, the north basin of Little Cedar Lake behaves differently than the rest of the lakes, and it just happens to be significantly deeper than most of the other lakes, which is causing some of the differences. So it actually maintains its oxygen and it stays colder than the rest of the lakes do throughout the summer.
That was a question I had. When you were talking about the lakes and the measurements, what depth were you measuring?
So we try to start at the top and we do 1 meter intervals all the way down as far as we can. So I can get to the bottom or pretty close to the bottom in most of the lakes. The exception is Wall Lake. I think we're probably a few, I don't know, 2 or 3 meters from below, above the bottom. And Little Cedar is, I think, 40, might be 45 feet deep. So I have it's about a 33-foot cord. And so I only get down 33 feet. There's a lot more lakes down there past what I can get. But I'd have to buy a $1,000 cord or something like that. So it works for what we need.
When do you think we'll be getting some of these results?
I can share the results. They're just not compiled in a format that may be particularly easy to read or understand. So if you have questions, I'm happy to actually sit down and can provide particular data.
Okay.
But it like I said, it's not really in a format that may be kind of easily understandable. So.
Will it be sometime soon?
Well, we will have a final report that we will submit at some point, and then all that data will be in there.
So there's actually we're doing 2 seasons of data collection.
Okay.
And so you don't always want to give all the data before you're done collecting all the data, because then now you've got different versions out there.
I understand.
But it's all going to be in an understandable, centralized location when that watershed management plan gets submitted for review. And those draft revisions are going to go through other, steering committee members' eyes before they go to final submittal to EGLE. So you will see them before they get submitted for approval from EGLE. But that's probably not going to be till, December of next year is probably when we're looking at, having some data we could probably share and feel pretty good about. Because we still have one more season of our tillage survey we have to get done. So, yeah, you're looking at December 2021.
Just wanted to know if there was something we needed to be working on now instead of waiting until it's too late.
And certainly.
And we can talk about it.
Yep.
Yeah. So moving on, the one thing that was different, a couple of the lakes are kind of have twins, right? So Little Cedar and Big Cedar Lake are very similar in their water chemistry, particularly the conductivity and total dissolved solids. Very typical of what I would consider like a groundwater fed system. Wall Lake and Clear Lake are much lower in conductivity and lower in total dissolved solids, which makes me think that it's probably almost more of a rain. That rain actually serves as a much more important input to those systems. Moving on, there's a couple of charts, and so this is some of the chemistry stuff that we have gotten so far back from Grand Valley, from bringing some of our water samples to the lab. Up at the top, so this first page, this is our dry weather. So essentially we waited until a certain amount of time after it rained, so it's kind of like at base flow. And so you have the different sites, CC1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 there. There's a couple other things. There's things that are labeled blanks. So that's a test for us to make sure that we're actually not contaminating our containers or screwing up our process. So essentially we go out in the field and we pour distilled water into a tube or into a container out in the field and then submit that. And so blanks should be showing up at 0, hopefully. And if they don't, that means we screwed up. We also do duplicates. So sometimes you'll see a duplicate, or some of them are labeled DUP, and that's just one where we take the same sample twice, and so hopefully our duplicate, so like at the top CC5, duplicate should be similar to CC5. Again, so that we don't screw up our in-field sampling. It's a demonstration that we didn't screw anything up. So looking at some of these chemistry figures, the NO3, the NH3, different forms of nitrogen in the system. TSS is total suspended solids. SRP is soluble phosphorus, and TP is total phosphorus. And in general, it's all pretty low. And so, that's good. That's good for us to know. What we have below is, down here are the E. coli samples. And so this gives you some idea of how much E. coli we have. Let's see if I remember this. Partial body contact is 300 or no, full body contact is 300 or below, I think, and then partial is 1,000. And so ideally, I mean, you want E. coli as low as possible. But if it's under 300, it's pretty decent.
Can you explain what partial body?
Oh, okay, yeah. So partial body contact means you can. It's safe for you to like stick your hands in the water or to stick your feet in the water, but you probably don't want to stick your head in the water. Okay. Full body contact, you can go swimming. Okay. And the risk is that you would ingest E. coli and may end up getting sick from that E. coli, from coming into contact with that E. coli.
I have another question for you.
Sure.
Okay, so at Wall Lake we have sewer. What about Big and Little Cedar? They do not, do they?
I believe not. So, and so you can kind of take a look at what this is. So, looking, we'll maybe first start out for the lakes. The lakes are kind of at the bottom. You can see that in general, at this dry period, the lakes have very, very low E. coli. So, great, right?
What does it mean when we say LCS-L, and then like Wall Lake, it's got,
the LC&R? Yeah, so LC&R is we have to take 3 samples, one on the left bank, one in the center, and one on the right bank. In some of these lakes, it's, the outlet is only this wide, so we're literally reaching on other sides of the boat to do this. So in a way, they're kind of like duplicates. So most of, especially downstream, things are pretty good along Cedar Creek. But as you get to site 4, 4 and 5 in particular, which is actually in this general area, 4 is Broadway, 5 is Dowling Road, and the E. coli at base flow is high enough that it's not meeting the total body contact, which isn't terrible, but you can see that there's more in that section than there are in other areas. So why that is, we don't know, but there's some contribution of E. coli in that area.
Maybe farming.
No, there's 5,000 geese in here all the time.
All right, and then on the next page, we have our storms section. So we had a big rain a couple weeks ago where it rained like 1.25 inches. And so that morning we went out and we did sampling. So on this one, a lot of the lakes are up near the top, and then Cedar Creek sampling sites are down below. They're in a slightly different order. I probably should have rearranged these. Again, most of the lakes are pretty low. The exception was Wall Lake. Wall Lake was a little bit higher. Okay, so I don't know why. It could be the geese and geese poo that was washed in. What was interesting, and I don't have a great way of explaining this, but all of our creek sites had high E. coli. So every last one. What makes it really challenging to figure out is that if you look at Big Cedar, the sample is relatively low. Okay, and then I sampled at Al Gemrich's house, which is literally a couple hundred yards downstream, and we had high E. coli. And so, what I can't figure out is there's really nothing in between those two sites. And so I don't know where, if we had just some sampling error or something wrong with the bottles. I can't explain it unless there's some kind of sanitary sewer pipe or a big pile of geese that are in between.
Big Cedar in the past, if you take a canoe or something, there's some outlet that comes in from those houses up that way. And I don't know.
And that could be it right there. I mean, I don't know.
The question is, why would that change it unless septic fields are getting flooded out?
Flooded out, yeah. So.
Well, you also had 1,000 seagulls migrate through at the same time at that date. So
Yeah. So
they're all coming in and landing and
You should
moving
have
around.
that in the lake then too, at the outlet.
Yeah, you wouldn't think that, like, for example, on Wall Lakes, where they had, I counted 700 seagulls come through, that amount of E. coli would float through that thick swamp to get down to, I assume you're doing it below the dam, which really doesn't flow much. Were you guys walking back there to this sample site?
no, the sample site we couldn't get into the stream. The first time we were able to get into the stream. The second time we just didn't have a float, and so we got close, but we didn't get actually in it.
But the high levels are coming in after Big Cedar. So they're,
Oh,
yeah,
so that one's down there quite a ways down.
it's only like a few hundred, like 400 or 500 yards from the outlet of Big Cedar Lake. And right?
Yeah.
And Big Cedar Lake's not showing.
It's not showing. So there's
it's
something.
like something's coming in between Big Cedar Lake and
The creek.
CC6.
Well, and like you said, when you start running data over a period of time, you'll see if that's real or not.
Yeah,
it might be just a
That's why we hope to do
a
it.
random number.
The big elements for what us, and a lot of times you don't get that. You don't get that luxury of having multiple seasons. So that's definitely going to hopefully clarify something.
And we have some historical data too
Yep.
that you can compare to, so that'll be interesting to see.
Yeah.
You plan to do any genetic source tracking for the E. coli?
They've been doing a lot of that with I think on cold water, right?
Yes, the cold water has the thorn apple. We've never done it for the thorn apple. It was basically an even split on the cold water. And, sometimes it causes a lot of conflict as well. So that's something to consider before choosing to do source tracking.
Yeah, we did Fall Creek, and we did it above the farm and below the farm. I sat on that data because it would not be well received. It wouldn't work way high, so you can see points sometimes like that consistently, and yeah, it would be interesting to see if we could track that one down.
It sounds like almost confused things because there's some areas that were getting like human genetics and some that were animal or livestock, cattle, and it didn't make any sense on why we were finding everything.
That could be.
It was like confounding. It was just it wasn't clarifying things. It was leading them down this rabbit hole. So I mean, it's definitely something that we could add to the project after we get through this first cycle. Say, hey, we want to know more about where those E. coli sources are. You know, what they are.
You sequenced it? Was this? I assumed you just did fecal coliform and yeah. So you could distinguish that.
Nope.
I mean, it's the assumption that it's E. coli with it because it's fecal coliform bacteria here, and therefore there would be. So you can't really know for sure, but it's well linked assumption. But it would be interesting to take that and be able to sequence it. I don't know how much money that costs, but to see if it is, bovine or human.
There are like watershed plan update grants that could allow us to build like after we get through this 2-year grant, because it's not in this grant project, there's no funding for it.
Yeah.
If we've got those types of questions, there's money available for future grants to come back and say, hey, let's do some source tracking.
It would be interesting. I imagine we could do eDNA on that too, and that might be a little bit groundbreaking on the protocol, but.
I know somebody who's
Yeah.
He's building a house for that.
You want to talk about
Put that on
a publishing gold mine? That one would be eDNA on a E. coli to narrow it down.
We did do it on Augusta Food and Trade last week too, and the data actually turned out pretty good. And we got a Kalamazoo Community Foundation grant to complete the coli source testing. So it ended up being all birds.
Usually is.
All right, I want to quick move on because there's another couple of pages. One of the things that we documented as a result of some of the vegetation surveys was that a lot of the creek itself was in pretty good shape. At least the creek where we were sampling had a lot of natural vegetation, had good buffers, and so those are very positive things. The stream bed itself, you can see a table there that kind of outlines the percentages of the different components within there. The faster the stream goes, the coarser the sediments at the bottom are. And so that just tells you a little bit about how fast the water's moving. Macroinvertebrates, we found a bunch of different things. I don't have a significant a breakdown of all of this, but at this point, but we'll have a little bit more analysis of those and being able to distinguish between some of the sites into the future. And then we have a list of the fish that we found and the total number collected. And so you can look at the diversity of fish. One thing that we did have with some of the fishing that may have constrained our success a little bit was that there's a lot of vegetation and deeper water. So it becomes a little bit harder to shock the fish when you have deeper water and a lot of vegetation. It just doesn't, they can either get away, but they don't float, and it also just doesn't deliver the current quite as effectively. Yep.
We were using 2 backpacks, so the efficiency was a little higher, but the bars would be a lot better.
Any other questions?
Roughly what elevation drop do we have from, say, Wall Lake down to 2.5 miles?
Oh, I don't remember. It's not crazy huge.
Yeah, 1,500 feet?
Something.
I'm not gonna guess.
Yeah, I know. I did look it up at one time. I just don't remember off the top of my head.
Yeah, I'm gonna write it in the introduction because it's interesting information.
So if we find invasive species of fish or things like that, you're interested, or are you interested by, for example, the proportion of dolphins or things like that before lobster?
I mean, yeah, we'll be interested in all of that. I mean, we're looking for invasive species, and that can show up both in the macroinvertebrates, and it can also show up in the fish. When we do some of the plant stuff, the vegetation, we are scanning for invasive species as well. And like particularly on the plant end, I know we saw lots of purple leaf stripe and green canary grass and things like that. But I think within the streams, we didn't find a whole lot in terms of invasive species.
Because I was looking, I will find it before the end of the meeting, but we found a new invasive species in our lake. It's a European fish. I know it. I'm just looking for the
Okay. Yeah. And we aren't doing fish surveys in the lakes. So, yeah.
There's some kind of a lamprey-like creature in the creek. Is that?
I don't think they found that yet, but this isn't an exhaustive survey. So we didn't find everything that could possibly be in the creek, we found some stuff that were in these short sections.
Whatever you found is before it's on the list.
Is on that list.
Okay, thanks.
They're all native wood, like the chestnut sided.
I'm sure there's.
Oh, yeah.
We saw lamprey during the surveys, we just couldn't catch them. The water wasn't the best, so it was pretty turbid and pretty high.
They do, but you kind of have to, they come out of the sediment, so you kind of have to hang out to get it come out. And then they're small, I mean, most of them are pretty small, so it's hard to get them in your net, depending on how big your mesh is in your net. It's really hard to get them.
All right.
Great. So I'll try to be brief. I first of all just want to say congratulations to Cedar Creek for taking this on and looking deeper into the sub-watershed. I'm hoping I can highlight some of the things that you can do once you have a watershed management plan and some of the benefits to local water quality that can come out of projects like that. And also thank you to you all for being here and supporting, and congratulations on that as well. So the first project I'd like to go over that we're working on, you'll see on this sheet it's double-sided. There are 3 different projects. We'll just go briefly through them, and then you can see more detail on here if you'd like. The first is a Great Lakes Restoration Initiative grant that we currently have, and that's the Thornapple River Watershed Management Plan implementation. I apologize, these have the worst project names, really lengthy, but so that is to implement some recommendations in the Thornapple River Watershed Management Plan, which is a management plan that the Conservation District worked on from the 2000s and early 2010s, and it was approved in 2015, and then we got to work trying to find money to implement those recommendations. So the recommendations that we were working on, first of all, a lot of community education, and so there were things like articles and workshops, typical trying to educate and reach out to folks, get to know them. And then there was money to do cost share for homeowners to do inspections and replacements on failed septic systems, and also for agricultural producers to implement some best management practices. And if we have time at the end and anyone wants to know more about specific practices, I'd be happy to explain some of those. But you can see some listed out in here as well. So far, and we're about 3 years into the grant, we just have a few months left, but so far we have reduced pollutant loading into the Thornapple River watershed by over 12,000 pounds of nitrogen per year, nearly 3,000 pounds of phosphorus per year, that's just the reduction, nearly 52,000 pounds of biological oxygen demand per year reduced, and 1,800 plus tons of sediment being kept out of the Thornapple River watershed as a direct result of this project and the practices that have been implemented. And we actually still have quite a few agricultural management practices in the works, so those numbers will be even better by the time we're done. And so I know that right now you're looking at a lot of data and gathering input and all of that, but in the end, these are the kinds of things that you can see, and it's really nice to see that. So. The second project is assessing and conserving high-quality Michigan lakes for Cisco and walleye. So this is a Midwest Glacial Lakes Partnership project that we just started, just got it approved this month. And we're going to be doing a lot of assessment on, I know Matt was talking about how they go out and do the dissolved oxygen and temperature, and you can only go so deep, and it's kind of like one point in time, right? So what we want to do is assess the habitat suitability for cold water fishes, specifically walleye and Cisco, in these lakes over time. And their habitat, a lot of times we think of habitat as being like plants, right? Plants and food. Well, for Cisco in particular, inland lake Cisco, the most important part of habitat suitability is a combination of a high enough dissolved oxygen level and a low enough temperature, and they need that throughout the year. And so we'll have specialized equipment and be working with the DNR to be able to monitor those two factors throughout the season. And that will be on Big Cedar Lake, Little Cedar Lake, and Green Lake in Allegan County. That grant also includes some work for education and outreach. We'd really like to get to know, in particular, the lake associations and the lakefront homeowners. And we want to hear what you guys want to learn about. And we also want to hear what kind of formats you'd like that in. And we want to talk about things like the fish that are in your lakes and the habitat that is there, why they depend on that, and how different land practices might affect that, and what you all can do to protect the quality of the lake. So, really excited about that one. That's a 2-year project. And the third one is the Thornapple Kalamazoo Water Quality Partnership. So that's a 5-year project, and it's very similar to the first project I talked about in that this is working with landowners. This one will primarily be for upland wildlife habitat and agricultural practices. And this will include the entire Thornapple, so this money is available to be spent for cost share in the Cedar Creek watershed. So I'm hoping that Corey and I and Matt and I will be working together a lot to identify areas that could maybe use some outreach, some education, and might be interested in some of these practices. So I think the timing of that being a 5-year project and this project getting started a little while ago, I think that'll overlap really nicely. So I don't know if anybody had any questions. There's a lot more details than what I said on here.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah.
So, yeah, thanks for everyone coming out tonight. And like I said, we had to keep this kind of quick and short, and we're trying to throw a bunch of kind of new information out there. I'll be emailing everything that you got paper copies of. I'll be emailing all that out to you. And then hopefully if this video works out, you'll get a link to that too, so you can reference back to it and share it with any of your other, friends or landowners and neighbors. And then our hope is to start producing this kind of quarterly newsletter that goes along with our quarterly reporting. Because we're not able to do meetings very easily, we're thinking that might be the best method to communicate with you on a regular basis moving forward. So look for that around the first part of October. We'll be sharing a quarterly newsletter, and then Matt and I are available, right? Like this is part of our job is to do this project, and so if you got a question or you're wondering where what's the status of the project, in my neighborhood, call us, email us, and we'll talk and try and answer your questions. Again, we're trying to get through this as well as we can under the circumstances. And I think, as a whole, we're doing a pretty good job of trying to stay on those timelines and get things accomplished. I know early in the summer we were getting a little worried because, we've got all these different partners that we're communicating with and trying to get things approved and trying to get students started, with all the restrictions, and to be able to accomplish what we did this year is pretty amazing. So Matt's group and Grand Valley State were awesome to work with. Hoping to get more of you involved this year for the next field season, and get, especially with the policy and the protection stuff that's going to start coming online now. So we'll get some more communications going about that. But if you do have questions, we really got to be out of here before dark, but feel free to hang out and ask myself.
I have
I'm
two
available.
questions.
Yeah.
At Wall Lake, we spray for invasive species. Is that true for Big and Little Cedar Lake?
I don't believe
Not
they're
that I
doing
know
any
of.
of these control.
I wonder if that made any difference in the testing. And the other thing I wondered, will you have the same students coming back again, or will you have new students, or will
So
you pick Grand Valley, or will you go to Michigan State?
it's, well, they have to be in our consortium of schools. So there's, what are we at, 12 or 13 schools?
Yeah, it's like
12. And so we actually put out, basically, we put out this grant application and people apply for those positions. So Grand Valley's got a really excellent natural resources management program, and some of these students we have worked with in the past on water projects, aquatic projects. So this year happened to be 2 Grand Valley students. It won't be the same students for next year, I can tell you that, but it will be the same professor, I believe. Eric Snyder's back on for next year, so he's from Grand Valley. And we will be using the Grand Valley's lab again for next year. But yeah, those students could come from Central or Grand Valley or Western.
Some of the one particular student you had, parents live on the lake, so on Wall Lake. So that was very cool for us.
Yeah, so we had Sarah Grimes was actually my student. So one of our members, Frank Ballo, actually donated money to have an aquatic student this year because he knew we had this project and needed some extra hands. So it was cool to have Sarah. We actually hired her not knowing that her parents had, her family had property on the lake, so that was cool to have her involved.
Her father just joined our board too, so it all worked out so well.
Yeah. That's what I like about these projects. You can get all the community involvement, and there's a lot of connections, right?
And her father teaches science at our school, so that works too.
We got another science teacher in the crowd.
He's retired.
Retired. Oh, you're not called a science teacher anymore.
Yeah, I'm just a science guy.
Appreciate what you're doing. The one thing that always amazes me that when you have, I don't know, it's procedure 51 or something, but they never really test for a lot of chemicals that are in water, and they just seem to have a kind of a standard test. And so, for instance, when they have aerial spraying or something like that, you don't know what's there. And it's I know at Kalamazoo College they've been testing for years in the chemistry department in their arboretum, and they really go through a real spectrum of chemicals. And most of the procedures here are just kind of what I call agricultural or runoff or something like that.
A lot of what those factors are that they're testing with are traditional ones that can be tracked back for doing water quality indexes that have been done all over the world, really. And so it's pretty standard factors that they fit into an index, and each one has a weighting and a value in order to be able to compare one watershed to another. So you can kind of, because it's apples to oranges in watersheds, but when you do the factors, you can start to make some comparisons. So you have to have some kind of standard that way. But no, there's a lot of tests, but then also these are pretty doable in the field, and they're pretty affordable, and they're also, like you said, relatable to agriculture, but also residential and just standard stuff that are important to living things. But yeah, it would be interesting to have all kinds of organic tests and different chemicals and so forth to see what it is. But right, fuel would be an interesting one, wouldn't it?
There are. This is kind of like baseline. Like think of it as your baseline data.
Yeah.
There's going to be opportunities in the future where we're like, we still don't have this figured out, and maybe we need to do these battery of tests. That's where we can go after some additional grant project money to get some of that work done, or do it internally. Like we've done that. We take on a project and we get a researcher out and say, hey, go figure this question out for us. So yeah, there's always those opportunities.